you all. So when I was a little girl, my mom made a rule for our home that we were not allowed to have conversations about or talk about television shows or movies that we'd seen. Now, when I was a little girl, I thought it was because my mom thought there was something wrong with TVs and movies, or that she had some kind of moral quarrel with, moving picture shows. But then I had children of my own, and I realized that she made the rule because it is so boring to stand and listen to your kids tell you the plot of a television show or a movie that they've watched. Mom, have you seen that movie? No, hun. Do you want to see it? No. Okay, let me tell you about it. This is a conversation that happens regularly in my home with one of my kids who loves to tell me about the movies he's seen. And thus begins this convoluted retelling of a plot with stops and starts and details I don't care about. At some point, there's always a pause with, no, wait, I forgot to tell you that part. So we have to back the truck up, beep, beep, gather up a little more information and then go across the same territory we've already been over. And it feels like this happens about a dozen times before I realize that if I don't shut this conversation down, I am going to die of starvation. Like it's gonna go on forever. And so I say to my kid, you know what, honey? I'm just gonna see the movie. Just gonna watch the movie. And thus we begin our new series in Galatians, RETHINK, the book of Galatians on breaking rules and breaking bread. And this week we're exploring a large chunk of the book, the first 2 chapters, and then we're going to kind of hone in and focus on the end of chapter 2, Galatians 2, 15 to 22. And this is why. It's because for the first 2 chapters of the book, Paul is reconstructing these events, and it's difficult to follow. It's kind of dry. It's a little bit boring. It's a little bit like listening to my kids tell me the plot of a movie. And if you're really interested in putting all of the pieces together, then I encourage you to just see the movie. Go read the chapters. But for the purpose of this series and this sermon, I'm going to give you the equivalent of an IMDb write-up for the first couple chapters of this book. And if you don't know what IMDb is, well, check the interweb. It'll tell you. And then we're going to head into chapter 2, verses 15 to 21, and just spend a little bit of time there. So Galatians is a letter, which means it's a correspondence between a leader and one of the churches that leader most likely helped plant, helped lead, and helped start. And this letter, Galatians, is written by Paul to the churches in Galatia, churches that he helped establish. And we can read all about this in the book of Acts. Now, Paul has left Galatia, and the churches he left behind have been kind of infiltrated by these leaders who are making claims in opposition to the gospel that Paul preached when he was there. And these leaders are also questioning the leadership and authority of Paul. So while Paul preached that peace had been made for all people with God through Christ's death on the cross, these new leaders have come in and convinced the churches in Galatia that Christ's work is not sufficient. And they have added back in obedience and adherence to Jewish laws and customs. Representative of this, kind of the lightning rod issue, is the issue of circumcision. These infiltrators are insisting that it is not enough for Gentile Christians, non-Jews, in the Galatian churches to trust Jesus and then be a part of the community. They also must conform to Jewish laws and customs, including circumcision. And Paul is having none of it. He is terse in this letter. He is unapologetic. He's defensive. In fact, this is the only letter in the New Testament in which Paul offers no encouragement, no words of kindness. He takes this disruption in Galatia very, very seriously. In fact, he believes that it cuts at the very core of the gospel, and that if these churches and these communities continue in this behavior, they will cease to be Christian. And so Paul spends kind of the first verses in this book defending his authority as an apostle. He refutes some of the quickly spreading rumors about how he is leading people astray. And leading up to the verses that we're going to hang out in today, he speaks about a very specific situation with his good friend Peter, who was a disciple of Jesus. So Peter, who has understood and experienced this leveling grace of Jesus, this grace that has invited all of them into community together, Jew and Greek. He's a strong leader in the church. He has started to withdraw from sitting with and eating with and being in community with Gentile believers. And Barnabas, his sidekick, another leader in their midst, is following his lead. And the result is that there are kind of two classes of Christians in these churches. Now, there's not a great equivalent for this situation in our day and time, in our culture, but maybe a potential comparison that can kind of help us understand what's happening here is maybe baptism. So let's say Kurt and I, as your leaders, decided that we were going to separate out our community by how you were baptized. If you were baptized as an infant, you could come to one service. And if you were baptized as an adult, you came to a different service. In addition, because both Kurt and I were baptized as adults, we wouldn't show up at the service for those of you who were baptized as infants. And before we invited you to come into our home and have dinner, we would check and make sure that you were baptized as an adult. And in addition, in our worship services, you wouldn't be welcome to come and partake in communion. You would have to sit out until you got dunked. You can imagine the fallout that would happen in our community if we did this. You can imagine how it would separate us, how it would create us and them categories, how walls of resentment and separation would be built between us. And as we imagine ourselves in this space, I think we also get a sense of why Paul was so upset and so adamant that this community get their behavior in line. Let's start by listening to Galatians 2:15 and 16. And he's speaking to Peter here. You and I are Jews by birth. We're not sinners like the Gentiles. Yet we know that a person is made right with God by faith in Jesus Christ, not by obeying the law. And we have believed in Christ Jesus so that we might be made right with God because of our faith in Christ, not because we have obeyed the law. For no one will ever be made right with God by obeying the law. So this is what Paul is saying to Peter. In order to be right with God, in order to trust Jesus, you abandoned the law. You realized that you had to give up your reliance on Jewish customs and behaviors, your reliance on your Jewish heritage. You relinquished that in order to embrace Christ. You believe that getting God's good gift of righteousness by faith and not by virtue of your Jewishness. That's how you believe that you got it. And yet now you are requiring Gentiles to embrace the thing that you had to relinquish in the first place. How does this make any sense? And Paul tells Peter that this is the ultimate hypocrisy. First off, because now the community of faith is not embodying their faith in the way that they came to faith. And also because this faith was meant to give birth to a community of unity and oneness where there was once separation, and now they're putting those boundaries back in place. The way that they were living with one another was creating and nurturing fissures in a community that was meant to live in loving relationship with one another. This community is not embodying the truth of what it means to be saved. Now, many of you have heard the metaphor that Paul uses in other passages of Scripture for the church He calls it the body of Christ. So the church is the body of Christ in the world. And basically, Paul is saying here, you are cutting up the body of Christ. You are disembodying Christ in the way that you are treating one another. Which leads me to this amazing statement that I read this week from N.T. Wright. Ecclesiology is soteriology on display. Nerd, right? There's maybe one or two of you in here that's like, oh yeah, that's so cool. But probably most of you aren't feeling that way. It's okay, I'm gonna explain this to you. Ecclesiology, you guys are going away so smart today. Ecclesiology is the study of the church. So when we talk about ecclesiology, we're talking about all of the things that we think about, our theology about the church. It's how we live together in community as the church. It is what we do as a church. It's our systems. All of the things that make us a church is ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the discipline of studying the church. And soteriology is the study of salvation, the theology of salvation. So when we talk about soteriology, we're talking about all of the things that we talk about when we think about salvation, how we get saved, how we live out our salvation, how a saved group of people makes a life together. All of the ways that we wrestle with salvation is called soteriology. So this statement is basically saying, how we live together as a church, our ecclesiology, how we gather as a community, it reveals what we think about salvation. So when Peter began to behave as though Gentile Christians had to become Jewish in order to live and eat at the same table with him, he was undermining the very basis of salvation, the cross of Christ. The way he was living in community was revealing something that he was adding to salvation. He was giving a false impression of what Christ did on the cross. And Christ defeated the power of sin to separate and alienate us from one another. And Christ was bringing reconciliation and renewal to all things. And by adding to Christ's sufficient sacrifice, Peter was misrepresenting the way that everyone got included in the first place. You can't separate out ecclesiology from soteriology. So, I wonder how we create divisions and compartments within our communities that keep us from loving one another or keep us from rubbing shoulders with people that we are meant to be in community with. How do we add to the good news that Christ dealt with the alienation that we had with God and that we have with one another? And by doing so, reestablish the very alienation that Christ put to death on the cross. It could be theological points of view, denominational lines, relationship status, gender identification, nationality, religion, moral behavior. There are all kinds of things that we add to that sufficient work of Christ on the cross. Where are we tempted to back away from the implications of radical grace that the gospel brings us in the ways that we welcome one another into community? See, nothing needs to be added to the work of Christ on the cross. It is sufficient. And so nothing should be added to our embrace and welcome in community. Our ecclesiology should match our soteriology. Now, I feel like I know the next question that's kind of rising up in some of us. Does this mean that just anything goes? Does this mean that it doesn't matter how we behave, doesn't matter what we do? Well, it's likely that this same angst, this same question, gave rise to the Judaizers in Galatia in that day. This Jewish community that was part of the church, they would have been raised to believe that the chosen people of God, which was now the church, but used to be the Jewish people, they looked a certain way, they acted a certain way, they revealed their identity in the world by following strict guidelines as set out in the law. And then they saw all of these like immoral, law-breaking, idol-worshiping Gentiles entering their communities, and they could not conceive how they could live together without falling back into those identifiable community markers that they had shared as a Jewish nation. In fact, some of these Judaizers were saying that because Paul was claiming that there was nothing more than faith in Christ required for belonging, that his preaching, his gospel, made Jesus a tool of sin. His understanding of salvation was going to result in all kinds of bad behavior. And this is how Paul responds. But suppose we seek to be made right with God through faith in Christ, and then we are found guilty because we have abandoned the law. Would that mean that Christ has led us into sin? Absolutely not. Rather, I am a sinner if I rebuild the old system of law that I already tore down. For when I tried to keep the law, it condemned me. So I died to the law. I stopped trying to meet all of its requirements so that I might live for God, and my old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. I don't treat the grace of God as meaningless, for if keeping the law could make us right with God, then there was no need for Christ to die. Okay, so this is what Paul is saying here. First, if you were made right with God because of what Christ did and not through the law, you can't go back and say that following the law is going to keep you in or is going to keep you in good standing with God. If it had no power then, it has no power now. Instead, he is saying, if the cross is the way that you came to be right with God, then the cross is the way that you carry on living in the ways of God. You see, the Jewish people knew what it looked like to be a Jew. It looked like following the law. It looked like not eating with people who worshiped idols. It looked like being circumcised. It looked like staying separate from other people. But what did it look like to be a Christ follower if it didn't look like being Jewish? And Paul says here, it looks like crucifixion. If you got right with God through crucifixion, your life together, your transformation, your embodiment of this truth in the world also looks like crucifixion. Crucifixion is what makes us Christian. This is what Greg Boyd says. The power that is empowering disciples to live a cruciform life and to bring peace between once hostile groups, and the power that will ultimately unite everything together under the headship of Christ is nothing other than the power of the self-sacrificial love that is most perfectly displayed on the cross. So what does living a cruciform life look like? What does it mean to be crucified? It looks like sacrificial love. It looks like hospitality and generosity. It looks like self-control and forgiveness. But these do not come about as we mandate them or add them to a list of things to do. They are nurtured in us as individuals and as a community in the way that Paul says here. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. And so I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. So Paul says, letting Christ be central means that I don't do what I just want to do any longer. It means I am no longer the driver of my life. It is Christ. And so everything I do in and with this body, I do for Christ who loved me and gave himself up for me. So, this verse, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I have been crucified with Christ. Like, theology books have been written about what these verses actually mean. What does it mean to you have this life, you have this body, and in your body you have the dead you and the alive you and the dead Jesus and the alive Jesus. There's just lots to talk about. It's all kind of living inside of us. And what does that mean for how we live? Does it mean that we give up all of our personal preferences and our personality, that we cease to be ourselves? We are dead to Christ? Some theologians think that. Or does it just kind of a flowery phrase, and it means Jesus gives me a new start. Jesus helps me become my best self. What do these verses mean about our identity, for who we are becoming and who we are in the world? Does Jesus just give us a new lease on life, or does it mean we don't exist at all anymore? How do we talk about this? How do we live this out? Well, I'm kind of the opinion that both of these things are kind of working together. That we are called to die to certain things in order to live a cruciform life of love. But I also think that living this way makes us more ourselves, more us. It's kind of a mystery and also unique to each of us how this is worked out, when and how these 2 or 4 things, the dead Jesus, the alive Jesus, the dead us, and the alive us, work together in us to make us whole. But one little story I think might help us sort of get started to understand what it means to kind of hold this tension in us. So my oldest son has always been a very reserved kid. He loves adventures and risk-taking, but he hates attention. He does not like to be the center of attention. And he's always been very independent. So when he was little, he didn't want lots of hugs and kisses, and he didn't want to be singled out or be embarrassed by things. That was really difficult for him. And when he was in kindergarten, we used to walk to school together every day. And there was another family that would walk to kindergarten at the same time. They were often behind us or in front of us. And one day, Brennan went off skipping ahead of me, and he fell and skinned his knee. Now, I might have shown him more attention if I hadn't known that this mom and her little girl were walking behind us. And I knew that he also knew that they were behind us. And so I just kind of was like, "Are you okay?" And he was like, "Yep." And then off we went to school. Well, the mom who was following behind us probably saw him fall and also noted my I didn't respond as she would have responded had her little girl fallen. And so she made sure she went up to Brennan and said she'd seen him fall and asked him if he was okay. And I was just face palming, because that was exactly the opposite of what he wanted or needed in that moment. My mom response would have been the same as her mom response, but I knew that wasn't what Brennan wanted. But because I knew and loved him, I could respond in that circumstance the way he wanted rather than the way I felt I should respond. And I think this is kind of a limited metaphor for what Paul is talking about here. And theologians call it joint attention. So we are ourselves. I am always going to be a mom, and I'm always going to feel compassion for my children. But we also orient ourselves to who Christ is. So I learn to understand and do what my son needs or wants rather than what I need or want. You might experience sort of an idea of this joint attention with someone you know really well. Maybe it's a spouse or a partner or even a good friend. And sometimes you're sitting in a group of people and someone says something, and you know that if you make eye contact with that person that you know in the group, your bestie or your spouse, you're both going to start laughing. So you better not make eye contact. You know what they're thinking. That's called joint attention. And the closer we are to Jesus, the more we share his outlook, the more we see and respond to things the way that he sees them and responds to them, the more we share his affections, the more our joys are his joys, the more we share his sorrow. And what grows this affection and this point of view in us is not adding on more requirements or putting more rules in place. It is not living out of our anxieties that somehow we need to manage other people's behaviors. It is living a cruciform life, and in doing so, growing in love and knowledge of Jesus. I wasn't always good at understanding my oldest son's needs, but the more time and attention that I gave to him, the more I learned how to respond and listen well. The better I got at understanding who he was and what he wanted. And it's the same with Jesus. The more that we attend to him, the more we get to know him, the more we practice living in union with him, the more we will use our physical bodies, our lives here on this earth, to allow Christ to grow in us and to live in us. So what does a Christian look like? They look like Christ. They look like self-sacrificial love on display. And sometimes union with Christ means we give up parts of ourselves, we empty out, we die to things. And sometimes it means parts of us are strengthened. But through it all, as we allow Christ to grow in us, we also become more and more of who we are made to be. Okay, I want you to pay attention to one last thing that Paul says in this passage. But suppose we seek to be made right with God through faith in Christ, and then we are found guilty because we have abandoned the law. Would it mean that Christ has led us into sin? Absolutely not. Listen to this, you guys. Rather, I am a sinner if I rebuild the old system of law I already tore down. I am a sinner if I rebuild the old system of law that I already tore down. Remember that Paul is calling Peter out in this passage because he won't eat with uncircumcised Gentiles. He's calling him out for requiring Gentiles to become Jewish before they are accepted in community. And Paul is saying that all of these ways that Peter thinks that these Gentiles are sinful or unclean, their immorality, their idol worship, this is not what he should worry about, because serving sin is withdrawing from the table, not disobeying the Torah. Serving sin is rebuilding these walls of separation in what should be a unified and loving community. The table is the embodiment of this loving community gathered around the broken body of Christ, gathered around the crucified Christ. It is the antidote, the table is the antidote to the sin of withdrawing from the table. You guys, if Christ is sufficient, if Christ's death reconciles all of us to God, and if Christ's death is continuing to do this reconciling work in our midst, then this centrifugal force, the cross of Christ, is strong enough to hold us together, and there is no need to build fences and to gatekeep. We can let go of our boundaries. We can lean into Christ. We can lean into the work that Jesus did in the cross. We don't need to lean out again onto old ways of categorizing who is in and who is out. And when we gather around the communion table, when we break bread together, we experience the presence of this cruciform Christ, this Christ who is sufficient for us and who is also sufficient for the person next to us. It is a spiritual practice that forms us into the people of God. And so this morning, we're going to come to the table together. We're going to practice communion. You can get your pods out. I know these pods are an insufficient picture of what it means to eat together, but let's do it with this in mind. That this table is an invitation to peace and reconciliation with God through Christ. But it is also an invitation to peace and reconciliation with one another. Because as we come to this table together, we are also drawn closer to one another. So I'm going to say the words of institution. For those of you who haven't done this before, the little trick is to push it down before you try to take the top off. I'm going to say the words of institution and we're going to eat together. I hope you're having trouble with yours because I'm having trouble with mine. Okay. On the night in which he gave himself up for us, he took bread, he gave thanks to God, and he broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Go ahead and eat. Christ's body broken for you. And when supper was over, he took the cup and gave thanks to God and gave it to his disciples and said, "Drink from this, all of you. This is the blood of the new covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." The blood of Christ poured out for you. In conclusion, we're going to pray a prayer together. You can just read along, but there are a couple spaces where it's bolded. Where it's bolded, I just ask you to read along with me. And so, in remembrance of these, your mighty acts in Jesus Christ, God, we offer ourselves in praise and thanksgiving as a holy and living sacrifice. In union with Christ's offering for us, as we proclaim the mystery of faith. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. Pour out your Holy Spirit on us gathered here and on these gifts of bread and wine. Make them be for us the body and blood of Christ, that we may be for the world the body of Christ, redeemed by his blood. By your Spirit, make us one with Christ and one with each other and one in ministry to the world until Christ comes in final victory and we feast at his heavenly banquet. Through your Son, Jesus Christ, with the Holy Spirit in your holy church, all honor and glory is yours, Almighty Father, now and forever. Amen.